Hey everyone, this is a book review by Marcel Stoetzler of Nationalism and the International Labor Movement, The Idea of the Nation in Socialist and Anarchist Theory by Michael Forman. This book was published in 1998, and this review was published in, looks like 2006. It was in Historical Materialism, the journal. So here we go. I find I get a lot out of reading book reviews. If you don't do that ever, you should start. It's good for you. Michael Forman explores the tension between internationalism and nationalism in political ideas developed in the context of the European labor movement and puts them into perspective with earlier Enlightenment concepts of cosmopolitan patriotism. The main thinkers discussed are grouped together as members of the three internationals, including Bakunin as a member of the first international. The inclusion of anarchist theory, although represented through Bakunin alone, and Forman's putting the labor movement into perspective with the Enlightenment, represented mainly by references to Kant, helped sharpen the view on the specific contributions and challenges that followed from Marx's interventions in labor politics. Although Forman does not exhaust the possibilities that his approach opens up, his book is the best starting point available so far for comparative analysis of liberal anarchist and Marxist conceptions of the nation. Forman starts out from the observation that for 18th century political philosophy, Condorcet, Kant, the constitutions of republics had per definitionem a cosmopolitan intent. They were meant to oppose the universality of the European aristocracy with a specifically bourgeois universality. In the idea of universal history, Kant suggests progress in history could be measured through what nations and governments achieve, quote, in relation to the cosmopolitan goal, end quote. After 1789, and especially 1848, the, quote, political history of the idea of the nation bifurcated, end quote. The bourgeoisie in its majority gave up republicanism and became, quote, proudly particular, end quote, while, quote, the internationalist movement of the socialist working class, end quote, preserved and developed the older bourgeois conception of, quote, cosmopolitan patriotism, end quote. Here, the, quote, inter, end quote, provided a critical edge against the, quote, nationalism, end quote, in the tension between the two elements. A significant number of positions flourished. Forman postulates that in the socialist context, quote, internationalism cannot exist without nations, and nationalism is self-referential without broader commitments, end quote. Socialist internationalism, quote, never meant the simple abrogation of the nation, end quote. In Enlightenment thought and in Sansculottism, or in Babeuf's thought, quote, the nation was always on the agenda, end quote. The international labor movement inherited republicanism along with other ideas of the Enlightenment, including equality and cosmopolitanism, and Forman argues that their nexus still needed to be preserved or rather reappropriated in its entirety against contemporary forms of particularist ideologies. Quote, the left must continue the project of the international labor movement while returning to its radical republican origins, end quote. The strength of Forman's approach lies in his recognition of two facts. One, that the nation was never absent from the agenda of the labor movement, against, for example, Nairn and Nimny, whose suggestion that the labor movement never took the issue seriously is a smokescreen for criticisms of how it has addressed the nation. And two, that socialist concepts of the nation are indebted to Enlightenment liberalism. Its weakness is the simplistic narrative of the, quote, bifurcation, end quote, of an initially wholesome concept. This lends itself to the popular notion that there are good, patriotic, liberal, socialist, and bad, ethnic, cultural, reactionary, bourgeois nations, which I argue renders banal and mystifies the intrinsic contradictions of the nation form. Forman points out that in discussing nationalism, the three internationals each had their characteristic pivot. For the first international, the national question was an issue of solidarity amongst workers of different countries. For the second international, it was an issue of workers of different ethnic backgrounds within a country. For the third international, the issue was nation building. Forman discusses as representatives of the First International between 1864 and 1876, Bakunin, Marx, and Engels. Bakunin shared with other 1848ers the notion that democracy, nationalism, and internationalism together formed the unitary foundation of a new way of politics, contrary to Ancien regime despotism, aimed to identify state politics with the popular will. For Bakunin, the most powerful opposition to the Ancien regime and its legalist and, quote, legitimist, end quote, ideas seemed to be expressed by claiming or demanding that what subsequently came to be called the, quote, civic, end quote, and the, quote, ethnic, end quote, nation be identical. As Forman writes, Bakunin's understanding of the nation was, quote, essentially populist, end quote. And throughout his life, he, quote, held to the intuition that nationality was a cultural fact of existence that had undergirded human personality and development since time immemorial, end quote. Bakunin's, quote, communalist, end quote, view of the nation and the commitment to insurrectionary politics in which the class intellectuals would, or the class A intellectuals, would lead peasants and urban poor are the two themes that lent continuity to his positions before and after he adopted anarchism. For most of his life, Bakunin had presupposed that a democratic republican state was the actual expression of the popular will of a nation, implying that conflicts between such states were actually conflicts between antagonistic nations. Only in the last stage of his life, by the time he joined the International in 1868, sorry, I got hair on my screen, it's bothering me. He opposed nations to states. The states Bakunin came to see as illegitimate and artificial creations, as an alternative to the republican form of state that for Marxists ought not make any reference to, quote, national culture, end quote, or ethnicity. Bakunin suggested the concept of, quote, federalism from below, end quote, a, quote, universal people's federation, end quote, that should combine, quote, the great socialist and humanitarian ideas of the French Revolution, end quote, with the, quote, politics of liberty of the North Americans, end quote. Such a federation would be based on the idea that, quote, all individuals, associations, communes, provinces, regions, and nations have the absolute right to dispose of their own fate, end quote. Within this concept, nationality, like individuality, counted as, quote, a natural fact, end quote. But, quote, the redemption of nationality through the establishment of a state was not a valid emancipatory goal, end quote. In the most important text of the nation that Bakunin wrote whilst being a member of the International, a polemic against Mazzini in 1871, Bakunin opposed, quote, patriotism, a virtue of states and statesmen, end quote, to, quote, national and international solidarity, a virtue of peoples and democrats, end quote. The state's, quote, artificial unity, end quote, that is, quote, mechanical, end quote, immoral, end quote, made from, quote, centralization, end quote, quote, absorption, quote, repression and exploitation, end quote, was contrasted to, quote, the moral unity of the nation, the result of a more or less temporary accord or harmony of different interest and spontaneously organized forces, end quote. In this text, Bakunin adopts a lot of the rhetoric that in the especially American Republican tradition had characterized the democratic Republican state. However, Bakunin uses the notion of the nation as a contractarian moral unity that ends repression and exploitation in order to denounce Republican states as structures of oppression and exploitation. Bakunin's, quote, Revolutionary Catechism, end quote, of 1866 stated that each nation had the, quote, absolute right to decide its own fate, end quote, prefiguring what subsequently would be called the, quote, right to self-determination of nations, end quote. However, as Bakunin conceived of state and nation as antagonistic to each other, legal and state citizenship were not part of his conception of nationality. Since, quote, liberty, end quote, meant life according to one's own inner law, quote, inner law, end quote, to Bakunin, states are hostile to liberty because they impose a, quote, unity without roots, end quote. Footnote. It would be worthwhile exploring to what extent Bakunin shares the notion of the nation as detached from that of the state with Otto Bauer, see below, and also the idealization of the identity/polity and popular nation with Gramsci. In the majority of Bakunin's texts, and footnote, in the majority of Bakunin's texts, however, especially those that address the Slavonic rather than the Italian question, there is a much stronger sense of the nation as a pre-political ethnic cultural community of, quote, national character, end quote, and values. In a text from 1873, written after his expulsion from the International, Bakunin wrote in a rather different tone, quote, every nation, like every individual, is of necessity what it is, and has an unquestionable right to be itself, end quote. This was a straightforward statement of nationality as collective identity. As Forman points out, there are, quote, two irreconcilable views of the nation, communal and associative, end quote, in Bakunin's writings. Quote, nation, end quote, refers in one moment to a, quote, historical community, end quote, and in the next moment to, quote, contractual dissociations of provinces and communes, end quote, i.e. federations of, quote, historical communities, end quote. Forman stresses an important historical connection when he writes that no less than for Bakunin, the French Revolution of 1789 gave Marx and Engels much of their political language, end quote. This language was, of course, adapted to the new situation, in which, as Marx and Engels saw it, the working class, quote, was to pick up the baton the bourgeoisie had dropped in 1848 and lead the struggles for human emancipation, end quote. In formulations like these, Forman truthfully but uncritically reproduces a crucial aspect of the Marxist view of the nation. He does not consider to what extent the, quote, language of the French Revolution, end quote, disfigured and obscured the analysis of French post-revolutionary society. Nor does he consider how this in turn affected the notion of the labor movement, quote, picking up, end quote, that, quote, baton, end quote. The reality of the French nation belied the rhetoric of its revolution more thoroughly than liberal and socialist Republicans were prepared to believe. A less ideological look at French history shows that the French case actually illustrates the point that the, quote, political nation, end quote, and the, quote, ethnic cultural nation, end quote, are but different aspects of the same thing. As Forman writes, the revolutionaries of 1789 gave the demand for popular sovereignty institutional form for the first time in Europe, but this does not warrant his conclusion that, quote, henceforth, the nation was a political construct and citizenship was a function of choice. Participation in the nation did not imply territorial, ethnic, or ascriptive prerequisites, end quote. As Forman himself admits in a footnote, quote, not everyone was included and certainly not equally, end quote. He points to the exclusion of women but suggests to the defense of republicanism that it, quote, that it was, quote, perhaps not a necessary theoretical corollary of the prevailing notion of the public sphere, end quote. However, quote, notions, end quote, that members or representatives of that society have their own doings and creations need to be distinguished from these doings and creations themselves. Defenders of the Republican non-ethnic nation-state, then as now, tend to claim that the revolutionaries of 1789 thought and declared such a state ought to exist. In order to make a convincing case, however, they would have to show either that it actually existed or that the reasons that prevented it from coming into existence have been, or at least can be, overcome. Forman, together with Kant, Engels, sometimes Marx, and cohorts of others, take the ideas of 1789, end quote, too much at face value. Apart from the commitment to republicanism typical for all left-wing veterans of 1848, Marx and Engels' concept of the nation is pivoted on the fact of the increasing universalization of the capitalist mode of production and the potentially internationalist working class, end quote. In Marx's view, quote, the task of the working class was not to oppose the freedom of trade and the industrialization that threatened traditional societies, end quote, but to understand and to use this transformation. Marx saw cosmopolitanism as a first condition of emancipation. At the same time, internationalism was for Marx not just a strategy chosen or not for its usefulness. Rather, internationalism follows objectively from the category of class as a social relation that is intrinsically international, as it is an element of the capitalist mode of production. Although the working class empirically, in its concrete historical specificity, constitutes itself within the framework of different nation-states, it is international on a categorial level, abstractly as it were. This double character translates within Marxist strategy into recognition that the class is, to a larger or smaller extent, national, but its cause is not. Forman writes that Marx and Engels were, quote, far from dismissing or ignoring the appeal of nationalism, end quote. But in Marx and Engels' conception, there was no place for any notion of primordial or pre-political communities. When, in the manifesto, Marx and Engels argue that capitalist modernity would break down the frontiers of, quote, nations, end quote, they refer to economic and political structures whose transformation would certainly affect, but not necessarily abolish, the differences that nowadays tend to be feted as national, ethnic, or, quote, cultural, end quote, identity. Footnote. Marx's critique of political economy included a critique of the leveling force of totalized commodity exchange that reduces every object to mere quantities of the same essence, value. The critique of the capitalist mode of production implied, therefore, the possibility of developing a defense of actual difference as well as a rejection of the fetishized forms of difference such as, quote, national identity, end quote. Discussing this important implication, however, would transcend the framework of this essay. End footnote. Marx and Engels' modernism is evident in their attitude in issues of colonialism and national independence. Their sympathies tended to lie with whoever they considered to be contributing most to the process of developing modern bourgeois society, thus unleashing the dynamic of class antagonism. Within this framework, the independence of Poland, Ireland, and Italy, the Union's victory in the American Civil War, and paradoxically, British colonial rule in India could appear as moments of the same historical force. Forman points to Marx's dialectical understanding of bourgeois society in his discussion of the, quote, Jewish question, end quote, where Marx rejected Bruno Bauer's view that national minorities should give up their particularities in order to attain political rights. Marx argued that members of minority groups could and should have full political rights irrespective of their particularities, and went on to argue for the more emphatic concept of human emancipation, in contrast to narrow political emancipation as the aim of social revolution. While Bruno Bauer, who later turned into a full-blown anti-Semite, demanded that the Jews give up their specificity in order to become full citizens of a bourgeois political order, Marx's position envisages a post-bourgeois order in which such differences would not determine the extent of an individual's social inclusion. Forman argues that when Marx and Engels held that, quote, national differences, end quote, would disappear before the triumphant workers, Marx and Engels referred to hostilities between nation-states, not to particularities of language and culture. They did not dispute the existence of cultural and language specificities. For example, Engels was eager to point out that the Polish state, whose independence the International supported, contained, quote, at least 4 different nationalities, end quote, and he stressed that a similar case could be made for all major European states. However, nationality and ethnicity did not figure as relevant categories of political strategy in their writing and political practice. Marx and Engels' internationalism was, quote, not about solidarity among nations, it was about principled solidarity among wage workers, strategic solidarity with political forces whose projects further the advancement of the proletariat, end quote. For Marx and Engels, the nation was an aspect of the capitalist mode of production, and the duality of a world market and a system of territorial nation-states, which it created. They understood the, quote, principle of nationality, end quote, a phrase coined in the 1850s by Louis Napoleon, quote, to indicate the communal origin of state authority, end quote, to be antagonistic to the older principle of republican patriotism. Neither Marx and Engels nor Forman gave much thought to the fact that the bourgeois state was driven into the ethnic discourse in its desperate search for a response to those social forces that questioned its legitimacy. In other words, the labor movement embraced and defended with republican patriotism a concept of the state that by its very existence it forced the bourgeois to abandon and to replace by its complementary opposite, the ethnic concept of the nation. The claim that the nation is a political and not a cultural entity was more difficult to defend the more it was empirically wrong. The, quote, ethnicization, end quote, of the nation state was a, quote, quasi-objective, end quote, process, in the sense that the bourgeoisie had to intensify an ethnic cultural feeling of national belonging in response to the resistance of the working class, in response to the resistance the working class had to put up. Socialist Republicans relied thus on a concept that became more and more untrue, anachronistic, and in this sense ideological. The shift from patriotic to ethnic nationalism in Bakunin's writings could be cited as evidence in support of the observation that, within the framework of bourgeois society, liberal or socialist movements were unlikely to be able to immunize their republican patriotism against ethnicization. The social form, as well as its intellectual reflections, transmutes behind the backs of the antagonists. Forman is prevented by his primary aim, defending Marxist Enlightenment republicanism, from seeing the dialectic that determines in the latter's actual history. The Second International had the character of a forum for discussing and coordinating the principal strategies and tactics of parties that had a mass following in their countries. The debate on the national question shifted towards ethnic diversity within states, especially within the Austrian and Russian empires, where solidarity between workers from different nationalities, quote, was a question of the structure of the working class itself, end quote. Lenin's thinking on nationalism started from the struggle with the Jewish Bund over the structure of the party. While the program of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party suggested, quote, recognition of the right to self-determination for all nations forming part of the state, end quote, i.e. the right of a nation to secede from the state, or secede from the state, that's actually how you say it, secede from the state, it denied, quote, national self-determination, end quote, within the party. Forman suggests that the Bund, quote, aimed to organize the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party along the lines of ethnic identity, end quote, when it tried to be recognized as the Jewish section of the party, with a claim to representing all Jewish members all over the empire. Lenin defended the, quote, local unity of all Marxist workers of whatever nationality, end quote, against the organization of the party in ethnic sections. Forman writes that Lenin and Stalin followed Kautsky's notion that external threats, the need to tackle large-scale projects like irrigation networks and generalized commodity economy, necessitated the formation of nations as in large social units typical of modern capitalist society. For Kautsky, this included the amalgamation of languages and their constitution as vernaculars. Footnote. Kautsky's position is roughly identical to what we now tend to refer to as Gellner's modernization thesis. End footnote. Lenin expected the bourgeoisie to abandon nationalism in keeping with the globalization of the bourgeoisie's hegemony. Nationalism would then be reduced to an ideology of the reactionary petty bourgeoisie only. Lenin, like Kautsky, would have supported nationalism of the former, quote, progressive, end quote, but not the nationalism of the latter, quote, reactionary, end quote, type. For Rosa Luxemburg, quote, the nation as a homogeneous social political entity, bracket, did, and bracket, not exist, end quote. However, quote, nationalities, end quote, did exist as ethnic and cultural groups constituted by history and in constant flow. Kautsky, Lenin, and Luxemburg agreed that the dominant tendency in the expansion of the expansion of capitalist relations was towards integration, assimilation, and universalization, such as in the formation of larger states. However, Luxemburg understood that a world order of separate nation-states for each and every, quote, ethnic group, end quote, defined in any way whatsoever was unthinkable in this context. Forman points out that Luxemburg was at the same time more aware than her comrades that, quote, the broad trend towards centralization and assimilation coincided with an opposing tendency toward local autonomy, end quote. Rather than the nationality principle, Luxemburg advocated general cultural freedom of expression combined with modern economic development in the framework of local self-government without any national character. The national would be confined to the cultural sphere. It would not be a principle of political organization. Like other members of the Second International, Luxemburg presupposed that social revolution will be engendered by developed capitalist relations, organized in a liberal democratic state, which therefore had to be supported against the remnants of traditional society, most emblematically, Tsarism. Luxemburg welcomed, like Kautsky and Lenin, the modern republican state and understood the notion of the ethnicity-based nation-state as a mere chimera. For Luxemburg, the state is, quote, a structure for class rule, end quote, while the nation is a, quote, undifferentiated cultural community, end quote. The claim of their identity is abstract, ideological, and antagonistic to democracy. It modifies the class relation expressed in the state to the disadvantage of the proletariat. Furthermore, and this is perhaps the most important point, it is necessary to look at what the specific content of any specific culture is. Luxemburg saw the socio-political implications of culture and objected to the hypostatization and fetishization of culture into nationality or ethnicity, as this meant the marginalization of its democratic elements, culture's democratic elements. In Lenin's position, Luxemburg recognized, quote, contempt for democracy and capitulation to nationalism, end quote, as two sides of the same coin. Lenin did not promote nationalism, but failed to exclude, as Forman notes, support for politics based on the pursuit. Lenin did not promote nationalism, but failed to exclude, as Forman notes, support for politics based on, quote, the pursuit of national independence for its own sake, end quote. When Lenin adopted the concept of a right of national self-determination as opposed to merely supporting national self-determination for specific reasons, Lenin broke a taboo in the Marxist tradition. Probably for the first time, a Marxist theorist suggested that support for a nationalist movement could be legitimized by reference to a, quote, right, end quote, rather than because the pursuit of Republican democratic politics necessitates the support of a nationalist movement. Rights, if they were meant in good faith, do not come with conditions attached. In Forman's words, Lenin, quote, espoused a bourgeois category as a concrete principle, end quote. Although Luxemburg shared the Marxist strategic paradigm that the development of capitalist relations is to be supported if they are to be overcome, she put more emphasis than Lenin on strengthening capitalist relations democratic and fighting their undemocratic aspects. The nationality principle and the ethnic reinterpretation of existing states figured on the side of the undemocratic. She found that Lenin avoided a critique of the concept of the nation, but Luxemburg's position, which is also more or less Forman's, needs to be criticized too, as the national state and the republican state have in reality never been two different items. It was a central element of Marxist strategy to support the development of the capitalist mode of production in order to make it transform itself, with or without revolution, into socialist society. As such, it had to embrace the nation-state in some form, as it was and is an integral element of the capitalist mode of production. If one means by, quote, nationalism, end quote, the building of nation-states out of smaller geographical and societal units, one of the defining processes of 19th century European history, then one has to admit that all Marxists supported it. The qualification has to be that Luxemburg was more vocal against the ethnicization for the national liberal state and the dissolution of multi-ethnic states into nation states. For Lenin, nationalism could be either a modernizing or a reactionary force, depending on the case. Luxemburg denounced nationalism tout court. Luxemburg failed to see, however, that nationalism, in the double sense of nation-state formation and the ethnicization of a state's culture and society, is intrinsic to capitalist modernization as embraced by the Second International. For Luxemburg, the democratic promise of the republican state had to be defended, as it was a crucial precondition of socialist transformation. This perspective, which Forman shares, needs to be subjected to criticism, however, because the dichotomy of democratic republicanism and undemocratic nationalism is in reality less clear-cut. In the last decade of the 19th century, the leadership of the Austrian party sought to develop a concept that would salvage the territorial integrity of the Austro-Hungarian Empire while changing its political form. At the Brünn Conference in 1899, it adopted a conception very close to what was later realized as the Soviet Union, that suggested the transformation of the double monarchy into a federation of democratic states, each of which would grant cultural autonomy to all its populations, end quote. Excuse me, no, that's not a quote, is it? Sorry. That apostrophe wasn't a quote. At the Brünn Conference in 1899, the Austrian party adopted a conception very close to what was later realized as the Soviet Union that suggested the transformation of the double monarchy into a federation of democratic states, each of which would grant cultural autonomy to all its population's groupings without themselves being based on any national character. Otto Bauer aimed to contribute to the interpretation and concretization of this conception in his study from 1907, The Nationalities Question and Social Democracy, departing from the party line in some decisive points. Bauer's starting point was the conceptual separation of national autonomy from territorial statehood. Bauer sought to complement the party conception with a concept of the nation that did not rely on any of the, quote, political, end quote, dimensions, territory statehood institutions that were, in the 19th century, regularly part of the national liberal definition of, quote, nation, end quote. Bauer formulated an ethnic cultural concept that is paradoxically closer to Bakunin than to any other Marxist. For Forman, the originality of Bauer's work lies in his treatment of nationality as a, quote, element in the transformation of consciousness and personality, end quote. Bauer held the view that the national cultural community is relevant for whether and how working people, quote, emerge as fully autonomous individuals, end quote. Bauer uses the concept of the, quote, autonomous individual, end quote, in a Kantian sense, one who is free to take moral choices, and a Marxian sense, the fully social individual at the same time, trying to mediate the two. The obvious overlap between the Kantian liberal and the Marxian conceptions is that both aim at liberation of the individual from national narrow-mindedness. Bauer defines the nation as, quote, the totality of human beings connected by a community of fate into a community of character, end quote. quote, community of fate, end quote, means hereby sharing and experiencing fate together, but it does not mean that every member of the community actually has the same fate, which would, in Bauer's Kantian terminology, be called, quote, homogeneity of fate, end quote. While, quote, nation, end quote, is a, quote, community, end quote, quote, class and, quote, citizenship are, quote, homogeneities, end quote. Members of the same class or state have the same fate, but do not actually experience it together. They do not interact, as it were, in the concrete. A worker is a worker at any place where the capitalist mode of production prevails. In the same sense, an Austrian citizen is an Austrian citizen, whatever his or her cultural nationality, sex, place of residence, or other identifiers. By contrast, the nation, according to Bauer, is concrete interdependence. Interaction in everyday life, mutual determination, an empirical relation of coexistence, but not a, quote, essential, end quote, sameness. In order to distinguish the nation from, quote, narrower communities of character, end quote, Bauer stresses the aspect of, quote, totality, end quote. Only the larger unity of the nation is actually able to determine the totality of the lives of its members in their mutuality. Members of, quote, narrower communities, end quote, do not determine their lives mutually, but are determined by the larger unit, the nation.
Forman's presentation of Bauer is more sober than, for example, Nimny's. Yet in common with Nimny, Forman fails to discuss the contradictions of Bauer's static and undialectical conception of the universal and the particular, of the abstract and the concrete. The nation as a community which would determine its members' fate solely in their mutual interaction does not exist and cannot exist. The universality of developed capitalist relations sets a limit to the autonomy of any, quote, community, end quote. When Bauer stresses that the nation is different from smaller, quote, face-to-face, end quote, communities, he half-heartedly admits that the modern nation is itself an abstract, in today's parlance, quote, imagined, end quote, community of human beings that do not actually interact on a daily basis. His introduction of the concept of, quote, totality, end quote, seems to be an attempt to shift the nation into a middle position between, quote, narrower, end quote, face-to-face communities, such as neighborhood or family, and the state citizenry. It does not explain, however, how the nation could be both a concrete community and a community universal enough to determine the totality of the lives of its members at the same time. Such a rather undialectical dichotomy of, quote, community, end quote, homogeneity, end quote, needed to be criticized, but neither Forman nor Nimny meets that challenge. Forman writes that perhaps Bauer's most significant break from the theoretical framework of the Second International was the reversal of the expectation that the globalization of capitalist relations and socialism as their extension and transcendence would successfully annihilate particularities such as national characters. Bauer was in agreement with Kautsky and others that national homogenization is a crucial element of the constitution of bourgeois society. While caste or guild-based societies had prevented the evolution of pervasive national characteristics, the capitalist mode of production promoted those pervasive national characteristics through education, communication, military service, suffrage, migration, and the, quote, commercium, end quote, of class struggle. However, under capitalist conditions, national unity and culture find their limit in the class relation. Socialism will overcome that limit and usher in a world of diverse but internally homogeneous nations. Quote, The fact that socialism makes the nation autonomous, thereby turning its fate into the product of its conscious will, will nonetheless give rise to a growing differentiation of nations in a socialist society, to a sharper definition of its particularity, to a sharper distinction of its characteristics. End quote. Bauer. Whereas for Kant as well as for Marx, emancipation means that the individual becomes autonomous, particular, and free, for Bauer the nation also, quote, comes into its own, end quote. Forman makes the important observation that in the concept of national, as opposed to individual self-determination, quote, the regulative idea of autonomy loses its critical potential and becomes ideology, end quote. Bauer does not demonstrate how the, quote, self, end quote, determination of the, quote, individual, end quote, and that of the, quote, nation, end quote, would be mediated with each other. Indeed, they cannot, as Forman is right to state. Bauer falls back into the kind of antinomies that had formed the starting point for Marx's and already Hegel's dialectical treatments of individual and society. The practical conclusion of Bauer's argument was that the federation that was aimed at by the Brun Party Congress should not be a federation or territory-based small states, should not be a federation of territory-based small states, but a federation of corporate associations, i.e. voluntary associations of persons. Every citizen would choose to be a member in one of these corporations irrespective of her place of residence. This suggestion adapted to the state what the Bundists demanded at the same time as an organizing principle for the party. Three problematic aspects of the, quote, personality principle, end quote, have not been recognized by Bauer nor by Forman or Nimny. First, one wonders how one can, quote, voluntarily, end quote, choose to be a member of something that is defined as a, quote, community of fate and character, end quote, and whether the corporate body, that is the, quote, nation, end quote, is obliged to accept or reject new members without discrimination. Secondly, quote, the personality principle, end quote, in practice would turn the nation from, quote, community, end quote, to, quote, homogeneity, end quote. If it is abstracted from territory, the nation turns from a lived, concrete, everyday experience into an abstract organizing principle, which it is, anyway, against Bauer's view. Thirdly, turning nations into legal bodies would not redress the actual relations of power and exploitation that exist between ethnic groups. The most momentous statements of the concept of the nation by theorists of the Third International, which existed from 1919 to 1943, were by Stalin and Gramsci. Forman argues that for both, state building was a priority, and that in the conceptions of both theorists, the working class lost its theoretical centrality in favor of the nation. Stalin saw himself confronted with the task of building a new state from the debris of an empire. Gramsci looked for a practical alternative to the fascist way of securing national unity in an only superficially unified but existing nation-state. While internationalism still used to be a categorical consequence of the ubiquitous character of the relations of capital and class for the theorists of the Second International, for those of the Third International, it came to mean solidarity amongst, quote, fraternal peoples, end quote. From an intrinsic principle, internationalism turned into an accidental and eventually disposable element of strategy. The historical backdrop of this shift had been the failure of the Second International to prevent the First World War and the isolation of the Bolshevik Revolution in one country. In 1912, Lenin sent Stalin, who was exiled after he had made himself a name as an organizer of oil workers of many nationalities and religions in wage struggles with British oil companies in Baku, to Vienna to report on the Austrian discussions on the nationality question. Following Kautsky, Stalin criticized Bauer for overstressing the, quote, psychological, end quote, side of the nation, and underestimating the more, quote, factual, end quote, aspects such as language, territory, and economy. In his essay on the national question of 1913, Stalin adopted Kautsky's observation that nations emerged from a, quote, process of amalgamation of peoples, end quote. In the process of the development of capitalism, Stalin upheld, however, Lenin's rhetoric of a national right to self-determination. Indeed, Stalin not only departed from Kautsky, but went far beyond Lenin's position in his strategic demand that the party had to defend the right of quote, all nations, end quote, to self-determination actively, a practical impossibility, as Luxemburg argued. Stalin argued that the nationalism of a, quote, young bourgeoisie, end quote, aimed at franchise, freedom of movement, and of language, and coincided with the interests of the proletariat, without whose help it could not be successful. In this context, nation building was seen as one of the historical, quote, tasks, end quote, of the proletariat, in contrast to Lenin's writings. Stalin's conception also allowed for regional territorial autonomy within a federation. Stalin's conception also allowed for regional territorial autonomy within a federation, roughly in the spirit of what the Austrian party had voted for at Brünn in 1899. Lenin had accepted since 1918 the concept of a federation as an intermediary solution, anticipating that, after a successful revolution in the West, quote, the single worldwide state, end quote, would emerge out of the international. Forman concludes, quote, Stalin's position, like Lenin's and much like Bukharin's, that's not Bukharin, quote, Stalin's position, unlike Lenin's and much like Bakunin's, was that of a philosophical nationalist, albeit one who placed the rights of nations after the prerogatives of the party, end quote. From 1920 on, Stalin pursued the twofold project that sought to build a, quote, Soviet nation-state, end quote, inhabited by, quote, Soviet man, end quote, but which was also a federation of nationality-based states whose task it was to develop and integrate their populations economically and politically. For the, quote, nations, end quote, within the USSR, this limited the exercise of, quote, national sovereignty, end quote. The slogan of, quote, national self-determination, end quote, was used as a tool of an anti-colonial foreign policy aimed at the, quote, dispersion of the forces of imperialism, end quote, in the national interest of the Soviet Union. Forman adds that after World War II, the creation of sovereign states all over the world was a dominant historical tendency. Many national liberation movements took on a, quote, Marxist flavor, end quote. Despite the fact that the Third International had reservations regarding Third Worldism, quote, the Third World radicals and many of their counterparts in the West, end quote, developed a brand of Marxism devoted to, quote, national liberation, end quote, that was mainly based on Stalin's reinterpretation of Lenin. Marxism could become the foundation of a doctrine joining the unarticulated egalitarian aspirations of the poverty-stricken masses of the Third World, the national agendas of the westernized elites, and the experience of humiliation at the hands of colonialists and foreign elites, which they both often shared. The winner was, quote, the winner was nationalism, end quote. Antonio Gramsci was initially attached to the Sardinian independence movement, then a member of the Communist Party then a member of the Socialist Party, and in 1921 amongst the founders of the Communist Party. His representative at the Comintern he became the following year. Subsequently, he spent 2 years in the USSR. After Gramsci's return, he set out to, quote, Bolshevize and, quote, the Italian Communist Party. Gramsci promoted the principles of the Third International against what he called the, quote, economism, end quote, of the Second International, especially Kautsky's and Luxemburg's. It is not without its irony that the catch-all slander of the Marxist tradition, quote, economism, end quote, stems from Stalinism's fight against the remnants of classical Marxism. The main themes of Gramsci's writing were, quote, the role cultural tradition plays in social and political integration, end quote, and how to elaborate a, quote, praxis, end quote, quote, a, quote, praxis, end quote, that would bring Italian unity in conjunction with the socialist transformation of that country, end quote. Forman. Gramsci contrasted the concept of the, quote, people nation, end quote, to the reality of the existing bourgeois state, where, quote, the national, end quote, and the, quote, popular, end quote, the, quote, political juridical claims of collective existence and socio-cultural reality, end quote, were not identical. Gramsci's socialist critique of the bourgeois Italian nation-state was that it did not live up to its claim to totality. The community of citizens was not identical to the people community, and the, quote, Gramscian, end quote, party would set out to change that. It sought to galvanize the, quote, ethnic groupings, end quote, into a solid nation in order to make the state authentic and organic, a people-nation state. Forman points out that Gramsci's conception differs fundamentally from the, quote, red republicanism, end quote, of Marx and Engels, for whom the yardstick is whether the political form obstructs or supports proletarian internationalism. Proletarian internationalism draws its strength, however, from the dynamics of the social antagonism inherent in the capitalist mode of production, not from cultural and party politics. For Gramsci, the point is that a popular national state governed by the party creates political and cultural unity, drives out the traditional and elitist cosmopolitanism of the Catholic intellectuals, in the Italian case, and ushers in socialism in a balanced mixture of forces, in a balanced mixture of using force and creating consent. Forman's study succeeds in demonstrating that, quote, the conventional view that socialists, and especially Marxists, have dismissed or underestimated nationalism, end quote, could not be further from the truth. The question of how to relate to nationalism has consistently been one of the major issues for Marxists. However, the First and Second International saw the nation mainly as part of the problem, while for the Third International, the nation tended to be part of the solution. Forman himself embraces the position most emblematically held by Rosa Luxemburg when he concludes that, quote, one would be hard-pressed to find an instance where taking up the banner of nationalism, whether by workers or an element of their movement, did not end in disaster, end quote. A crucial perspective of Forman's argument is that he treats, following Luxemburg, quote, nationalism, end quote, and quote, republicanism, end quote, as straightforward opposites. His main point is that Marx and Engels continued to subscribe to Enlightenment cosmopolitan republicanism, while both Bakunism and the Marxist tradition increasingly substituted nationalism for cosmopolitanism, thereby trivializing, if not abandoning, the concept of internationalism. His conclusion is that the labor movement needs to return to the original conception of red republicanism and resist the nationalist protectionist temptation that is currently present, for example, in the movements against, quote, globalization, end quote. Forman suggests a, quote, return to Kant, end quote, and the adoption of three Kantian demands: republican institutions for every state, international law, and universal cosmopolitan right as, quote, a speculative ideal for the future and a regulative category for the present, end quote. Forman quotes Kant's Humean assumption that, quote, the spirit of commerce sooner or later takes hold of every people, and it cannot exist side by side with war, end quote. Forman admits, quote, perhaps paradoxically, end quote, that today's transnational bodies do not have the effect of furthering cosmopolitan rights, and indeed exist very well, quote, side by side with war, end quote. They, quote, seem to undermine democracy at the level of the nation-states themselves, end quote, and provoke, quote, nationalist appeals of the worst sort, end quote, even amongst, quote, progressive, end quote, opponents of transnational capital like the trade unions. Such a populist jingoism, quote, is precisely what the theorists of the First International sought to warn against, end quote. Forman states a, quote, growing need for internationalism among an ever more ethnically and occupationally diverse and globalizing working class, end quote, combined with an engagement for the, quote, profound transformation of international right, end quote. Forman finds that international agencies tend not to meet Kant's, quote, regulative criteria, end quote. The only, quote, multilateral body that begins to meet the republican criteria of Kant, end quote, seems to, quote, offer a vehicle, end quote, for related Habermasian hopes is the European Union. Quote, business internationalism needs, however, to be replaced by, quote, working class internationalism. Forman is silent on the issue of how such a transformation is going to be accomplished. He seems to be thinking of some kind of reform of the existing institutions, such as the World Bank, by somehow radicalized and internationalized institutions of the labor movement. The Achilles heel of Forman's discourse is his failure to take into account that the metamorphosis of cosmopolitan republicanism into, quote, ethnic and, quote, cultural nationalism has roots in the thing itself, not merely in the unfaithful thought and action of its bearers. Republicanism and nationalism are not opposites, but differ by degree only. His, quote, return to Kant, end quote, brings the argument back to its beginning. Kantian cosmopolitanism is offered as a conclusion when its vicissitudes have actually been the starting point of the labor movement's discussion of the nation. Forman concludes that, quote, national self-determination, end quote, should be supported only if it contributes to, quote, constraining arbitrary power, extending the accountability of political, economic, and cultural institutions, end quote, as well as, quote, global justice, end quote, cosmopolitan right, end quote. These demands might, in the present situation of expanding barbarism, look like tall orders, but they are nothing but good old programs but the good old program of liberal, at best social democratic modernization of the polity. Forman's invocation of Kantian categories in deciding which particular nationalism is, quote, worthy of support, end quote, contradicts his earlier statement that the reactionary movement of nationalism always gains the upper hand, at least in the long run. This reflects Forman's failure to discuss critically Marx's and Engels' own readiness to support some nationalisms as opposed to others, and the notion of bourgeois progress that underlies it. The failure to criticize Marx and Engels where they reproduced elements of bourgeois liberal thought leads to bourgeois liberal thought. In spite of the criticisms, Forman's is a very welcome presentation of the labor movement's relations to nationalism, and it cannot be wrong to call for a, quote, new commitment to cosmopolitanism and an internationalist orientation, end quote. Forman's book has more far-reaching implications than he is able to articulate, which speaks for its richness. In order to use much of these implications, Forman's argument needed to be linked to recent debates on the nature of the French Revolution. Marx's understanding thereof, and the more general critique of bourgeois, Feuerbachian, and, quote, populist, end quote, elements of social democratic and Leninist political thought. In other words, the discussion of the national question needs to be embodied more comprehensively in that of bourgeois society and bourgeois society's overcoming. By refuting conclusively the false claim that Marx and Engels underestimated the relevance of nationalism and patriotism, Forman's account opens the way to radicalizing rather than revising the Marxian critique of bourgeois society and its political as well as intellectual forms. This must include the recognition that Marxism's great historical failure, Marxism's great historical failure, end quote, was not its unqualified dismissal of, but to the contrary, its opportunism toward nationalism. The merits as well as limitations of Forman's book can be further illustrated by comparison with the position of Ephraim Nimni, who currently is a main contributor to the debate. Both Forman and Nimni discuss the nation in the context of more general conceptions of history and society. The point of departure of Nimni's book, Marxism and Nationalism, is to challenge the, quote, myth that economic modernization requires cultural homogeneity, end quote. He aims at, quote, deconstructing the institution of the nation-state and to look for novel ways of interpreting the right of nations to self-determination, end quote. Nimni objects to, quote, cultural homogeneity, end quote, but neither to, quote, economic modernization, end quote, which remains undefined, nor, quote, the right of nations to self-determination, end quote, whose existence is not questioned. Quote, too often the radical social movements engendered by liberal democracy and Marxism, judge nationalism to be a powerful tool for achieving their political projects, and they discover that the nationalism of nation-states led to their own undoing. End quote. Nimni opposes the, quote, nationalism of nation-states, end quote, but neither nationalism sans phrase nor state nor nation. Nimni's theoretical framework is based on a history of Marxism turned upside down. The mechanistic positivism that took hold of the Second and Third Internationals counts for Nimni as the deplorable, quote, legacy, end quote, of Marx and Engels, while the surviving elements of Marx's dialectical theory derive from the beneficial influences of, in the case of Austro-Marxism, neo-Kantian philosophy. As Traverso and Loewy wrote in a review, the, quote, promise of Nimni's essay is a caricature, quote, the premise of Nimni's essay is a caricature of Marx's thought and would be more appropriate as a characterization of quite different materialists of the quite different materialist Weltanschauungen elaborated by Kautsky, Plekhanov, and Bukharin, end quote. Nimny's evaluation of Bauer culminates in the celebration of Bauer's, quote, ability to deconstruct the duality nation-state and to develop a theory of the nation which analyzes national communities in their own terms, end quote. Bauer's specific statements on, quote, national communities, end quote, are rejected for carrying still too much of that, quote, legacy, end quote, of Marx and Engels. Nimny ends up with very little. The, quote, duality nation-state, end quote, has been, quote, deconstructed, end quote, throughout the history of most socialist and liberal thought, whereas it is perfectly unclear what it means to analyze national communities, quote, in their own terms, end quote, and why this should be a good idea. Footnote. On this issue, the earlier evaluation by Horace B. Davis remains more to the point. Quote, Bauer added nothing new to current definitions. He defined nationality in terms of itself, end quote. End footnote. The further away Marxists move from the mechanistic, materialist, metaphysically Eurocentric, class reductionist bogeyman that Nimny constructs in his book's first chapter, quote, the perplexing legacy of Marx and Engels, end quote, the more favorably they are evaluated. Gramsci and Bauer are the winners here. The contrast to Forman's approach is clear. Whilst for Nimny, the history of Marxism is a tale of the successful overcoming of the unfortunate, quote, legacy, end quote, left behind by its founders, Forman's sympathies are with the First and Second Internationals up to and including Rosa Luxemburg, to the extent that their Marxism was still informed by Enlightenment cosmopolitan republicanism. Nevertheless, Nimny and Forman converge when it comes to currently relevant conclusions. Forman recommends the working class reclaim the Kant of perpetual peace, and Nimny recommends the neo-Kantian reading of Marx by Bauer and Renner. Forman points to a worldwide Pacific Federation of patriotic republics as the best of all political forms, while Nimny makes the complementary case, following Otto Bauer, that cultural nationality be redeemed from its ties with the nation-state. In his more recent introduction to the English edition of Bauer's The Nationality Question and Social Democracy, Nimny presents his position in a different light. He suggests that Otto Bauer and Karl Renner were, quote, precursors of multiculturalism, end quote, who did to Marxism what Charles Taylor, Michael Walzer, Will Kymlicka, and Yul Tamir did, or tried to do, to liberalism. Nimny finds that the Marxist debate on the nation is of only, quote, historical value, end quote, and has, quote, little relevance to contemporary discussions on nationalism and political theory, end quote. Nimny emphasizes that the liberal individualist idea of choice that is central to the, quote, personality principle, end quote, Renner Bauer, is, quote, incompatible with Bauer's argument, end quote, and applauds Bauer for having shown that, quote, national, ethnic culture is a matter not of choice, but of social insertion, without which there are no individuals, end quote. Nimny celebrates the rather banal insight, staple knowledge in both liberal and Marxist traditions, as Bauer's important, quote, critique of liberal theory, end quote. Following on from this, quote, critique of liberalism, end quote, Nimny states that national identity can be, quote, of benign influence, end quote, a formulation he borrows from Giddens. If there are guarantees of, quote, differential rights for ethno-national communities complementing individual rights, end quote, he argues that a multi-ethnic state ought to be based on intermediate national ethnic, quote, corporations, end quote, that are legal bodies. These bodies, rather than the state, are, as in Renner's and Bauer's conceptions, meant to organize educational and also legal systems for their members. Quite correctly, in differing from Renner and Bauer, Nimny finds the conception is, quote, incompatible with the procedural equality of all individuals in contemporary liberal democracies, end quote. After having declared that Marxist theory is irrelevant today, Nimny also discards the bedrock of the liberal tradition, quote, the procedural equality of all individuals, end quote. Nimny enters here dangerous territory. Should his text correctly anticipate how Bauer's classic work will be received by contemporary readers, then a right-wing appropriation of Bauer's work might be expected, similar to that Gramsci's work received in the 1980s. Recognition of the many ways the labor movement and its theorists continued elements of the Enlightenment, liberal and idealist traditions are crucial but cannot serve as rallying points for, quote, returns, end quote. The internationalism of the Republican patriotic models needs to be replaced by a model of social solidarity that includes a consistent critique of nation and nationalism. Pretending like Bakunin, Bauer, and Nimny that the only problem with collective identities was that they were being used for building states is, quote, political reductionism, end quote. The Republican argument that the state is better not based on ethnicity is important but short-sighted, as it fails to address all other implications of the concept of nation and nationality. What needs to be asked is whether there has ever been or can be a patriotic form of nationalism as celebrated by Forman following Habermas, Kristeva, and others, immune from transforming itself into ethnic cultural nationalism. Or inversely, whether an affirmation of, quote, cultural nationalism, end quote, as conceived by Nimny following Bauer, is possible that would not sooner or later feed into, be used by, and be absorbed by state nationalism. Against the double perspective of an ethnicity-based multiculturalist anti-liberalism / anti-Marxism on the one hand, Nimny, and Kantian Habermasian attempts to resuscitate red republicanism on the other, Forman, an effort will be needed to recover what is most relevant and most radical in the Marxist and the wider Enlightenment tradition.